Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome to episode 10 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Kurt and Jerry. And we have another great topic today. We're going to really look at a concept of neurobiology and also talk about how it relates to trauma called the window of tolerance. A topic coined by Daniel Seigel. I also think Pat Ogden's another one of my favorite authors that talks about this in her work. So two of books I picked up really early. This was one of those key concepts, and I know really makes a lot of appearances in the trainings I do around trauma and stress, whether I'm talking to leaders about self-care or trauma-informed care. So really important strategy. It'll bring together a lot of the concepts we've already talked about as well. And to start off, like we do every week, we'll do our bright, shiny objects of the week. And since this will be coming out the week of Thanksgiving, I figured got to do something that we're thankful for. And we'll put a twitch on this, just with our experiences in the kind of the last year with trauma and the trauma-informed paradigm and things that we've seen maybe just happen in the community or in organizations we work with. And just some real positive things that we see out there sort of as a happy note. Last couple times we've been talking about a lot of trauma for our bright, shiny objects. So since I make up the subject, I'll start us out with this one, give my co-casters a chance to think of theirs. But, you know, the one thing that I really feel thankful for that I've seen happen really over the last probably 10 to 15 months is just a really explosion of the adverse childhood experience study. The understanding of trauma is just popping up. More and more books that I read that aren't specifically on trauma, but other mental health, behavioral sort of things. A lot of people are sending me like TED Talks just about every day. People doing great stuff with trauma. And I've also seen a real just heightened awareness in education as well. So, you know, if I'm thinking about something I'm thankful for around the trauma-informed lens sort of topic, it's really cool to see, you know, again, when Jerry introduced this to me 15 plus years ago or so, I felt just like a handful of people had this kind of secret we were all excited about and wanted to share. And now it's really out there in a totally different way. So it's a real cool thing to see. So Kurt, with that general topic, anything you're sort of thankful or just have gratitude for around the trauma-informed topic that we always approach?
Yeah, ultimately, I think often is when I get especially overwhelmed with the demands of work and everything that is on our plates to do, I go back to being very grateful that I live in a country and a society that values treating other people well and providing places where people come here enough that I can make a living doing this. I'm really am thankful for that I live in a country and a society that values that enough to create an opportunity for me to do this and to help others to do it as well. I have one experience from the last week that I love this aspect of training. When I get to do it, I've been doing some training with a group at work on trauma-informed leadership. And one of the topics that we're on now is on cooperation and how it's everybody's responsibility to do their best every single day. And that's their responsibility to the group. And that I use a TED Talk in this training. And part of the example of the training is to show a relay race and how the interface between every runner in the race is where the critical interactions happen. It's a great metaphor applying to organizations and cooperation. And there's a great scene from the video that this TED Talk shows of a relay race, and it shows one runner passing the baton to the next runner and it just happens to be the next to last leg passing to the anchor leg. And then you see the runner who just passed the baton screaming encouragement, like with everything that she has, to the next runner. And I love watching that and making the point to the group to say, you know, when I get really kind of overwhelmed with work or frustrated with work or coworkers, I always like to go back and think, when's the last time I wanted one of my coworkers to succeed that badly, that I was willing to do that? And I love that little reframe in that talk, and it helps me to kind of come back to work and go, man, how do I encourage people in a way like that I want them to succeed so badly that I would scream with every amount of energy that I have to encourage them.
Very cool. Should we scream at Jerry to encourage him as we hand off the baton?
Yeah,
hey, Jerry, what's your bright shiny object, brother?
Well, you know, being that you started off with thanks and gratitude, I want to take a moment to recognize the both of you and your incredible window of tolerance for my technological sophistication. So the fact that I'm on here and I'm on live is really due to the both of you trying to make this happen. So I have a lot of gratitude for the both of you today. Look at that. But I also want to take a moment and really reflect on the incredible work that is going on in our community. Is that people are really struggling with these concepts. You know, being trauma informed, I like to think about it in a little different way than some people. And I think about it almost like a meditation. So for me, when I meditate, about, you know, like 5 seconds into the meditation, my mind is wandering someplace else. And then I have to gently, in a compassionate way, bring it back. And it's a practice. And some days I could stay in it longer than others. And I think the organizations, many of them working with adolescents, working with, you know, young mothers, working, today I was in a pediatric clinic. They're really trying very hard to apply these concepts to make the services they are delivering more effective and more responsive to the clients they serve. But just like meditation, there are days they come in, the stress is so high, so overwhelming that they kind of get away from that, and kind of teaching them really how in a gentle, compassionate way to recognize that and get back on track. We don't become trauma informed and then we're there and we've hit this promised land and it's over. It's really an ongoing practice. So I really, I'm really excited about the two of you taking on this journey along with me, but also all the people that we get to touch in our professional life. So I'm very grateful for that.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, let's transition from that. And I think Jerry's example shows that we all have. We're not just talking about our clients, patients, students with this topic, but turn over to you, Kurt, and start us out on the window of tolerance, my friend.
Yeah, this is one of those topics that is like, I just love this one. I love the physiology of it. So I can get so excited about it that I can kind of overtalk it a little bit. So I'm going to try and tone myself down about this one. But
go, Kurt, go!
Thanks for passing that baton, Jeff. Yeah. Jerry, you were just mentioning about how we see organizations and groups go through this of getting stressed out, and they can get to a point where we get balanced, and then we get knocked out of balance. And then returning to balance is really the critical issue there. And that concept is really, I think, the bedrock of understanding the window of tolerance, in that our bodies are equipped with a method to deal with environmental demands and activate resources to deal with what we need to deal with. And then, you know, maybe that's running away from a lion, maybe that's dealing with an email that you need to respond to. But then our bodies are also designed to have a mechanism by which we return to a balanced state. And that really is the job of the autonomic nervous system, to balance those two things out. And this window, the concept of the window of tolerance is a great one that Seigel really kind of coined that term. And hard to believe that's what almost 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago. To help to understand both the autonomic nervous system role in that, but also the brain role in that, and the brain-body connection there is really the utility of this window of tolerance concept. And so, to review a couple of concepts that we've talked about before, we touched on how the brain is organized in a hierarchical fashion, such that information enters the body and it goes through a systematic process of being organized by our body and by our brain. So sensory information enters our body through sensory receptors. That information is then funneled to our spinal cord, which delivers it to our brainstem, and it starts there. And then all of the brainstem reactions start. And then that information keeps going up to the limbic system, and limbic system reactions start. So we may start to feel things, even though changes in our basic arousal level had already started to happen. And then once information passes through the limbic system, it can get to our cortex. And that then becomes when we start to put a story to things, when we start to make sense of what's going on at lower areas of our brain. And this connection between the brain and what happens with our autonomic nervous system is really facilitated by the vagus nerve. And that is a mechanism by which, and a pathway by which, our internal regulation system and our arousal system becomes connected to what happens in our perceptual systems. And I shudder to think that there's some neurobiologists listening to this and hear how I oversimplified that whole thing. That to kind of teach it, right, you got to simplify it, and I may miss a lot of details in there. But I think conceptually that's a good way to understand that. So we have this balance then between the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, which is our parasympathetic and our sympathetic divisions of the ANS, where the sympathetic division is really the gas pedal. It's the driver. It's what gets us activated, and it organizes us to deal with environmental demands. And then the parasympathetic is the side that is the brake, that it can slow things down. And the balance between those two things, interestingly, is one of the most fascinating areas of research that I've come across. That's probably one of my bright, shiny objects of the past 5 years, that understanding that level of detail about how that works. And so there are plenty of models. And of course, Stephen Porges is one of just the preeminent models of having polyvagal theory and how that works. I've loved a lot of what he wrote. So going from there, that's kind of an overview of the stress response, how it's connected to our brain. Actually, there's a great example in there, I think, of how sensory information can travel from outside of our body and cause changes in our regulation system. And Dan Gilbert, a professor at Harvard, gives a great talk about how information that happens inside of our body can also do that. That what we're equipped with as human beings is this frontal cortex, which gives us the ability to use it as an experience simulator, where we can imagine something, or we can imagine going through an experience, and we can learn from it without actually having to do it. And I don't have to stick my finger in every single light socket to learn. That's not a good idea. I can imagine what that may be like and avoid doing it. And so we can imagine what it's like to win the lottery, and that can change our state of arousal. So it's fascinating how our bodies and our brains are connected in such a way to be so adaptive to changing environmental demands. We're really quite a fascinating species and kind of machine to do that. So there are, Matt, I know you have some models that you like to talk about with the window of tolerance. There are some models that we can also think about to understand it. I think that'd be helpful for folks.
Great. And if you upset any neurobiologists out there, I'm sure I will make you look really good with this. Because I've found a lot of success. Again, whether I'm talking about self-care, whether I'm talking about leadership, whether I'm talking about a way to conceptualize the effects of stress on the folks that we're working with. And it's an analogy, a very simple one. It involves cups. And there's two parts of the analogy. The first part of the analogy is the size of the cup. And this is really our ability to hold stress in our life without losing our bleep on somebody. I told you I was going to get very scientific here. But we've all been there, right? We've all been to the point where we're about ready to lose our bleep on somebody. So the cup gives us capacity, and through a lot of research in wellness and health and all that, a few things that I have found that increase our capacity to hold stress, having people in our life that love us, things like exercise, sleep, some of those real basic self-care pieces, mindfulness practice over time. And really the size of our cup for the most part, at least in this model, doesn't change a whole lot. I mean, the one thing that kind of collapses the cup at times could be trauma, because it just overwhelms our ability necessarily to cope. So the healthier and in some ways the better life we're able to live, and some of that's determined by our social networks, our social economic status, our ability to afford healthy food, those sort of things, the larger capacity we have to hold stress. And then as the cup starts to fill up, the second part of the analogy is the water in the cup, which represents the stress hormone, again, to simplify everything, cortisol for the most part. So that stress hormone. And as there's more cortisol in our cup or in our body, which the cup represents, it starts to close the window of tolerance. So when I think about what's the window of tolerance means to me, it's really the ability that we have to engage our prefrontal cortex and our cognitive brain. Daniel Seigel, somewhat famously in our circles, says, when we're in our window of tolerance, we're flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. And those words have meant a lot to me over the years, since I think I started to read The Mindful Brain, or some of his first works. And I really started to look at the folks that I was working with in different settings. And, I realized there wasn't a high level of flexibility. There was a lot of all or nothing sort of thinking. I remember famously, I had this client who was always, I think he skipped the last 3 sessions, didn't show up for my outpatient sessions with me. And then I assumed he wasn't still going to show up for our 4th scheduled appointment. And God forbid, I was running like 3 minutes late, and the guy's like standing on the chair threatening to kill everybody in the waiting room. And I'm like, hey dude, what's going on? He's like, you're late. And what it really kind of taught me about that flexibility piece is that when we're in a high stress mode, and when our cup's sort of full, or we're at the edge of our window, we don't have a whole lot of flexibility in our thinking. It's hard to kind of just roll with changes in the environment. Adaptive, I see as kind of long-term flexibility. So what we see with adaptive is the ability to really make some key changes in your life becomes difficult. Another example that I see across the country when I work with those working with people experiencing homelessness is that we have these great Housing First programs where we'll get somebody in their own apartment, because a great way to end homelessness is to give somebody a home. And because of epigenetics and how their brain's structured, they don't feel safe in that apartment. So what we find is, and it's a small group of people, because these programs overall are incredibly successful, is the person, we check in with them a week or 2 later, they're storing their stuffs in the apartment, they're still sleeping out on the park or under the bridge. So adapting is hard. Coherent, I'll probably leave it a little bit to both of you when we get to the hypo-arousal or freeze response, to talk about that dissociation. But again, I kind of use this as stability from a very simplistic mode. Is we don't know if the client we meet on Monday, if we were seeing the same client on Wednesday, if it's going to kind of be the same person. Are they going to love me today or hate me today? But there's just that emotional instability, and then energized as well. And a lot of times, as I like to joke, especially working with a lot of teenagers, is they had a lot of energy when they were pissed off at me. But sometimes what we ask people to do to manage educational loads or being in services, there's just not the kind of the energy to always follow through. So one of the things I realized is, boy, so many, in fact, I'd say the vast majority of people I see didn't have that flexibility. They weren't adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable, which started to tell me that their cups we're pretty filled up. And when our cup starts to fill up, Daniel Seigel tells us, a lot of times we'll start to react in one or two ways when we're getting to the edge or outside, kind of to the outskirts of our window of tolerance. And that's with rigidity or chaos. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of those later. And so I see those as some of our last grasp efforts to kind of gain control of what's stressing us out. And then obviously if the cup overflows, then we're in that fight or flight or freeze mentality. So it's just a really good way. And I started to ask clients, hey, how full is your cup today? And not kind of surprising at that point, because I started to get some of this information is, about 90 to 95% said my cup's full. And I think it just kind of shows the accumulative effect of stress, where like re-traumatization and other things can kind of flood our cup all at once. I thought about what my kids or their families were dealing with just throughout their normal day. And, some were struggling with addiction. I can't imagine as a 13-year-old waking up in residential care. I mean, just that alone. I knew my cup got filled up when I worked in residential care. They live there 24/7. And so I started to really look at what stressed my folks out, and I could understand, why their window of tolerance is oftentimes, not very open. And again, what we try to do is build a resiliency, which allows them to be more in their window of tolerance. But a lot of times, at least initially with my relationship with them, they were sort of always on that edge, always right on that brink of reaction. So it really gave me a way to think about it in a different way.
A couple of things I heard you say, and then I want to kick this over to Jerry to talk about something I think this leads to, which is, so we talked about that there is a reason why our bodies would be equipped with a way to deal with environmental demands. And then it's important to get back to really within the window of tolerance, which is an optimal arousal zone, kind of. And then you started talking about that as we shift up and down this level of arousal, there are different parts of our brain that are available to us to use to deal with environmental demands, which gets us into one of the most useful concepts I found, which is the arousal continuum. It kind of talks about what happens to the brain in this interactional relationship between the autonomic nervous system or the body and the brain. So Jerry, if you can talk a little bit about the arousal continuum and what's available to us when we get stressed and what's less available to us when we get stressed.
So you guys did a really good job of overviewing some of this, but one of the things I want to kind of touch on, one of those is that when we're in a safe environment, safe both physically and psychologically, we have the capacity to regulate our states. We have the capacity to socially engage with other people. We have the capacity, because our stress response system is also connected to our immune system, it regulates and modulates our immune system, with really manages inflammation in our bodies. And so we physically feel better when we're in these safe environments. So there's many of these, and then we can access higher brain functions. So what we know is that when we are able to access higher brain functions, we can integrate our sensations, our feelings, and our thoughts, and make some volitional, conscious decisions about how we want to respond. But our brains were not developed to only live in safe environments. So we've retained structures in our brains that allow us to live both in dangerous environments, but also life-threatening contexts. And that as we move from one environment to the other, we actually change what parts of our brains are mediating our responses. So it's interesting that Dan Seigel would pick an acronym like FACES, right? Because when we're safe, we're activating a part of that vagus nerve that is connected to our facial muscles, our inner ear, our neck, that allow us to use social engagement to interact with the world, to explore, to play, to grow, to do all that. Once we move from safety and we move into a sense of danger, that part of the vagal system shuts down and it allows the sympathetic system to get activated. And now we're in this fight, flight, really able to kind of defend, right? And so we're now in these individuals who come in. So when we're in that defensive state, it's actually shutting down our ability to social engage. So Matt, you have somebody coming into your session and you're Mr. Social Engagement, and here's this guy in a defensive. He's not going to meet you with, oh, thank you for meeting me in the lobby here and coming. He's going to meet you either with withdrawal or with aggression. And you're going to be kind of, what's going on here is the cup is filled, right? The other piece I want to add to your analogy is not only do their cups get filled, but the size of their cups change over time based on their experiences. So when we grow up in a safe, nurturing, warm environment that we sometimes have to respond to stress, we actually have larger cups.
Yeah.
So that really the challenge for a lot of these is not only is there a lot of stress in their environment, but the size of their cups gets smaller. And so they become much more sensitized and reactive.
Yeah.
And the last piece of this is we've also learned to sometimes live in life-threatening. So some individuals who are in abuse or domestic violence situations or in situations they just can't escape, the sympathetic nervous system is not effective in helping them fight or run. It activates, as Stephen Porges would say, this dorsal vagal complex pathway, and we begin to shut down. We begin to withdraw. We begin possibly to become compliant. And it really is a damage inhibiting response, right? Because to respond and fight, I'd actually be in more danger. So shutting down really is a protection. But what it does then is I begin to feel helpless and powerless and all of those things. And so that our nervous systems were designed to live in multiple types of environments. But for many individuals, because the intensity of those experiences, how long those experiences have gone on, or they lack the availability of social supports to help buffer those, they get stuck in those states. And I think many of our clients come in and are struggling with really being stuck in those states. And that's really where treatment has to come, is that you need, with trauma-informed care and trauma-informed sensitive responsive, you need to respond and actually create a sense of safety so that this individual can somehow relax some of their defensiveness and allow some of that. But last thing I want to say is Stephen Porges talks about these defense mechanisms as hierarchical. Mm-hmm. So people who are shut down, they don't go from being shut down to socially engaged. They've got to first go back to being angry and not showing up or leaving and taking some level of control, so that in some ways your guy not showing up for 4 days may be a more healthy way than just shutting down in his life, to kind of look at that. So I think that this model of understanding how the stress response system works and understanding that many of our clients, although they're either aggressive or they're withdrawn, really it's an adaptation to an unsafe, threatening environment that they're carrying around with them.
I love that idea of the transition from state to where how states can become traits, and how we get stuck in these what would be temporary states to deal with extreme environmental demands become where we live all the time, that we become hyper-aroused or we become hypo-aroused. And that's one of the areas that I found was a great overlap between what's traditionally been a behavioral area of research, which is conditioning, and the trauma-informed model. Is that I harken back to my days in training in behavioral pharmacology classes, where I learned that physiological responses can be conditioned. That we like a conditioned compensatory response to a certain dose of a drug, and that actually that process and that mechanism can easily facilitate the shift from states to traits, and that our autonomic arousal levels can be triggered and really conditioned by environmental cues and by repetitive exposure to similar cues over time, where that can actually shift our internal state. So there's a good overlap for me between, kind of helped me to put it into my own language.
That's a really nice way to kind of think, right? Because in one way you could build up a tolerance to that drug, or you could build up a sensitivity to that drug.
Right.
Your body is adjusting to that to kind of manage that. And I think it's really important, because when we're in these different defensive states, our prefrontal cortex and our language ability is being downregulated, right? And so we tend to want to talk to people, to try to be relational with them, to try to get them out of these states. And really, it's about their nervous system. It's about trying to create a sense of safety, not about, in some ways, verbally engaging in some dialogue, but really what's happening non-verbally and what's happening in the environment, sounds, just physical location, proximity to people, your tone of voice, your facial expressions. So when, this is really common in residential treatment centers or in a foster home, is that when kids or young adults start getting dysregulated, we want to in some ways talk to them and hold them accountable, or want to kind of be relational with them. And really what we need to be thinking of, what do we need to do to reestablish a sense of safety?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think that that's a really important component of any type of treatment, is how do we in some ways create some safety so that people can in some ways re-engage socially with us.
Yeah. It reminds me of a study I read a few years ago. It was actually done here in Denver by a student at the University of Denver, who went around the community and put up a bunch of flyers, recruited people to be in his study, who had experienced an extreme depressive episode in the recent past. And then he measured their level of sympathetic arousal. And then he looked at, everybody got treatment. And basically he showed in this study that if you had a high level of sympathetic arousal, it basically blocked the effects of relational engagement. And that even though everybody got the same level of relational engagement, if your stress response wasn't able to facilitate that engagement, it didn't work. Right. So it kind of goes right into what you're saying about how do we then create a sense of safety, or essentially state regulatory, before moving into relational or reasoning kind of interventions, is really, and that's certainly a challenge for everybody. It kind of goes against our cultural ways of thinking about solving problems of this nature, which is certainly a difficult one.
Yeah, and how our fields and our programs are often set up too. I got a question for both of you, and it's something that I've thought a lot about over the years, but I would love to get your thoughts on one of the things with the state or to becomes a trait. So when we talk about the fight, flight, freeze, so those are 3 different states, if I'm hearing you right. Help me understand, because when I think about getting, let's say, in the fight mode, which luckily I don't get a lot, but there's something ticks me off and I'm going towards the stress, I'm yelling, I'm being verbally aggressive. So that's, I would imagine, a state that I'm in. But the intensity of these 3 responses, help me understand this, seems like if that became a trait, I'd probably be dead from cortisol pretty quickly. So help me understand how fight, flight, freeze, which all seems like really extreme reactions that we're not kind of capable of sustaining over weeks to years, becomes a trait.
You want to go for it, or you want me to do
it? Don't fight over it. Don't fight over it.
So Matt, you really ask a really good question, right? Because I bet there's a lot of people out there wondering, how does this happen?
Yeah.
And it happens through adaptation, right? So the work of people like Rachel Yehuda is looking at how does the body actually adapt to this, right?
Yeah.
Well, you look at, I know Dr. Perry talks a lot about the sensitization or building tolerance of it. But what ends up happening is, say that you get really stay in a environment where you get triggered quite often, right? It's chaotic, it's threatening, it's dangerous, right? For a long. So your body starts to have this stress response.
Yep.
So your body floods with adrenaline, so your heart starts pumping, right? And you do it. And then following that, your body starts releasing cortisol.
Yeah. In
the normal system, cortisol would get to a certain level and your hippocampus would read that level and it would start sending a signal, shut down.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But now what you're saying is, I'm in this environment and cortisol is flooding my body.
Yeah.
My cells in my body start changing the sensitivity of the receptors or the number of receptors. So now I could either have a low amount, now I release a low amount of cortisol when I get angry, but the receptors become more sensitized.
Yeah.
So I need less cortisol, but those reactions become greater. Or we could flip it over and say, I have lots of cortisol floating around in my body, but my receptors become tolerant or they are less. So now it doesn't matter how much cortisol I have in me, I'm not reacting to that cortisol in my body, right?
Yeah.
So that becomes, so you see that in depression. You see people with high levels of cortisol, but they're not processing to kind of look at that, right? So your body is adapting, which moves it from just a state that you went into, it now becomes a trait where your body is responding to these chemicals. So you have a disconnection now between the actual stress response to catecholamine, stress response, adrenaline, and how your body's reacting to that. So that's how that comes. So even though I'm angry all the time, my body may not be reacting to that cortisol in the same way. And so you see people with PTSD, which really didn't make sense to a lot of people for a very long time, is that they have actually low levels of cortisol, but they're more sensitive. So when they get a burst of cortisol, they have a higher amplitude of reaction and it takes them longer to return back to baseline.
Yeah.
Does that make some sense?
It does. So let me follow up.
Does that make sense, Kurt? You want to add anything?
So if I have a hypo-aroused trait because I'm using that to survive my situation, even though that becomes a trait, I can still get from time to time inside my window of tolerance again.
I think what you're asking is your window of tolerance shifts.
Okay.
So that the range can become restricted, or it can, in general, be shifted up or down as a range. So where you tend to stay and fluctuate between can be smaller, and it can shift towards being hyper-aroused, or it can shift down as a set to be hypo-aroused.
Okay.
One example is, I like to use the example of a guy named Miguel Indurain, who's a cyclist. To my knowledge, the lowest measured heart rate of a human being was Miguel Indurain. 28 beats per minute at rest. And so there's the floor of his window of tolerance. He gets below that, he's just going to die. It's just low enough. He can also, he's a highly trained athlete.
Yeah.
So he can tolerate jacking that heart rate up to 190, 200 beats a minute. And he can sustain that for a short period of time, but he doesn't, as they say, go vagal until he passes that, where the vagus nerve just says, we're done, you're going to pass out now.
Yeah.
So if you just do the math of that, I kind of like that example of 200 minus 28, it gives you a range. So now that range can be shifted to be smaller so that it's not the distance from 28 to 200. And it can also be shifted where the floor is 100 and the ceiling is 150.
Yeah.
Where you get this truncated range and a shift up and a shift down.
Great. So in my kind of simplistic model of the cup analogy, in some ways, a trait would be a decreased size and stress capacity before you would hit one of those hypo or hyper aroused responses.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Now, as long as it fits in my cup analogy, I can understand.
Sure.
Well, that's why I said, Matt, the size of the cup changes.
Right.
Yes.
No, right? As opposed to you always have, you actually are adjusting, your body is adjusting. Yeah. So for me, Mike, I start out the cup this large. If I stay under prolonged stress and the environment is unsafe, wouldn't it make sense for me to have a reaction of stress in an environment where there's constant threat?
Absolutely.
Where they're doing it is so that I'm adapting to an environment. So if I'm this kind of mellow guy who's walking around the jungle where there's predators, I'm probably going to get eaten.
Yeah.
Right? But my stress response system has adapted to that. I hear the smallest brush and my body is already ready to fight or ready to run or to do it. So that rather than thinking as a trait is a good or is a bad, is it
adaptive,
compatible to the environment that I have to live in?
Yeah. And I think just to take this from what I see really through all age groups, but I think it really stands out in school age kids that I see, is a lot of times that trait they need to survive in their maybe dangerous neighborhood or home they live in is not necessarily adaptive when they walk into a school and have to self-regulate themselves. And the fact that some kids do it is pretty amazing, that they're able to access and get in their window of tolerance to engage. But it just kind of, I think, if we think about, again, some of those traits needed to survive in one environment, then they become sort of maladaptive potentially if we change the environment dramatically on them.
That's exactly right, Matt. And we have to also understand as we talked about in the ACEs studies when we talked about that, is to stay in those states is a wear and tear on the system.
Absolutely.
So I may be adaptive to my environment, but now my ability to regulate inflammation and my ability to stay healthy and the number of fats in my bloodstream that are because I'm kind of processing, right? So my heart, I have increased level of heart disease, increased level of diabetes, increased level of respiratory problems. I have
inflammation everywhere.
So that inflammation. So in one way we're adapting, but for some of these children, long term, what we're learning is there's a cost to those adaptations.
Absolutely.
There may be also pulling a little bit of the behavioral side of what you were describing, Matt, is there could be an important distinction to be made between a state and an adaptive behavioral response in that state. And so fight, flight, and freeze are actions that we take that either they get selected by what happens in the environment or they don't, as a way to survive when somebody gets in that state.
Yeah.
So one state, it could be the state is terror.
Yeah.
In that state, you could adapt by fighting, fleeing, or freezing.
Yeah.
That could be, and then as those actions get taken or those symptoms get generated in response to the body's reaction to an extreme situation, then what happens after them becomes important to what gets generated over long periods of time as a habitual way of responding when we get into certain states or under certain conditions.
Yeah. So how do you guys see, because I know, again, I was introduced with Pat Ogden, kind of had outside the window of tolerance as the hypo aroused. Seigel throws in the chaos and rigidity piece. And I'd love, with the state trait sort of thing, do these kind of fall in? And I can almost see this more so as traits of rigidity or traits of chaotic behavior. But I think those are two really important things when we look at how this manifests in our folks. I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on those two reactions as well.
Maybe I could give a treatment example.
Great.
I think how this may work. And I hope I'm getting the question right with this, right? So this was a few years ago. We had a young girl in care, and she was actually living at home, but we were working really closely with her parents. And what we were teaching them was that her window of tolerance had really been shifted up towards hyperarousal. So shifted up as a range, and the range became truncated.
Yeah.
We do this basically by testing her resting heart rate repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
What we found is that she kind of lived at about 120 beats per minute. So that's pretty high.
Yeah.
And what we found is that given our kind of, if you've got a window of tolerance, it's kind of in the quote unquote normal zone of, we live at between about 60 and 90 beats a minute, right? When we get up, our urge becomes to bring ourselves down, to be back into our window of tolerance, or in that homeostatic state. So this young girl's homeostatic state had been shifted up. So when she got below 120, whereas for us, that would be, for her parents, it was like, oh, you're fine now.
Yeah.
He was not fine.
Yeah.
He became driven to bring it back up.
Yeah.
And so she would then engage in property destruction, or all kinds of symptoms that then her parents would have to deal with.
Yeah.
So one of the really cool interventions we did was to put a heart rate monitor on her and to connect that to an app on her parents' phone. And we then had to teach them that when they were looking at her heart rate, that when it got down, it wasn't time for them to go, oh, good, she's fine.
Yeah.
She's regulated, we can let her go.
Yeah.
That was the time that they needed to go and engage with her.
Yeah.
And allow her then to engage in some activities to titrate her level back up to where it felt right to her. So that was a great one. And I've heard many, many stories from people talking about that living at this state, and that when they get down, they get worried that they're now in a normal zone relative to the population, but to them it feels like they're depressed.
Yeah.
And it feels like it doesn't feel right to them, so they get driven to bring it up, and then we all perceive that as they cause chaos.
Yeah.
Right? They get driven to bring it up, so we interpret it based on our own lens of our own window of tolerance, and that is a really, I think, important point to make with caregivers, and especially with parents and people who are interacting with these kids, is to teach them that their stress response is really kind of opposite what ours is. And our engagement pattern needs to be shifted in that way. And once we do it, it can actually go quite well.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example. I always think about the chaos theory, and again, a trauma-related response of not having the ability through damage to the language areas, including the Broca's areas of the brain, to really say, hey, I'm getting pissed off right now, using, that chaotic, sometimes through verbal, to get space between them and what's causing the stress. Kind of like a flight response in some ways, a way to kind of escape it out. But I love, looking at from that biological perspective is incredibly powerful way to see it as well. And I think is very complementary in a lot of ways too.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Jerry.
No, so I think, Matt, really what you'd like is you'd like to be able to have structure and predictability and whenever you need that. And then you'd also like to be engaging in spontaneity and laughter and having a good time and getting right. So there's movement back and forth in if you look at Daniel Siegel's, he talks about that river and the banks is you could go over here and go to work and follow these procedures and follow these protocols, but then I could get off with my friends and have a good time and do it. But when we are in that stress state, as Kurt so clearly talked about, some people, when they get into stress, they get disorganized and impulsive and can't really get themselves to kind of effectively have a strategy to respond. While others go and they get really rigid and this is the way things have to be and I need things in place. And if you move this off my desk, I'm going to freak out because this is the way they work, right? And so really this internal state of being overwhelmed can be managed by either moving towards chaos and disorganization or this sense of, I need every rigidity, I need to know what's going on. So he looks at really what Kurt talked about is that internal state of arousal, but people have different places they go to manage that based on their own biology, but also based on the environment, what was supported and what wasn't supported, and kind of looking at that.
Yeah.
So I think he really talks about trying to begin to understand that when you're looking at these people who are really rigid into doing it, for them to move towards even a little away from that is going to create stress for them because that's the way, or this person who's disorganized and over here and all over the place jumping, for them to kind of slow down a little bit is going to, and I think your point really kind of highlighted that, is that when that young lady lowered her, what we would think is highly aroused, she felt like, oh my God, I can't tolerate that, partly because I bet you she was afraid that if I get too quiet, I've got to deal with my feelings and I'll get overwhelmed. Yeah. So staying in those high states really was very defensive. Mm-hmm. So really beginning to understand this balance of whenever you get locked into either end of that continuum, that becomes problematic and symptomatic.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, one of the questions we have on our list, which I know we're getting close to time, but I think is important to do, is how can we help people expand, get in their window of tolerance, increase the size of their cup? How can we help people who are struggling with the states and traits, so to speak? I guess really what we're talking about is emotionally regulate their stress response. And I want to throw one out. One of the ones I think we miss, this is like a lot. I've got a lot of thoughts on this, but the one that I just keep coming back to is exercise is so critically important for people. When we talk about, I always think about, with the cup analogy, that I've not found anything better, like just kind of from a human wellness perspective, as getting exercise, because it gets that cortisol back out of the cup. And I think, one of the things that in my learning of stress that I found really powerful and always just sticks in the front of my mind when I think about stress is really, for the most part, stress, that person back in the jungle, stress was somebody trying to eat us or us needing to eat something else because we're about ready to starve. So it always included a physical reaction, most of the time. It didn't include checking emails, sitting in boring meetings, sitting in rush hour traffic. So, I think that's one that we often overlook, especially as when we cut PE budgets and other things in schools. But for a lot of folks, that was one that has made my top list. And would love to get you guys' thoughts on that and other things that we can do to really help folks manage both things we typically do, but also maybe out of the box stuff as well.
I think in a real general sense, Matt, the concept I think of a lot is parasympathetic tone, which is the analogy to a muscle is great here, because you can talk about muscle tone, right? Which is and the capacity of a muscle to do work. And the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system has that ability to fluctuate in its ability to do work in titrating the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. And exercise is such a great example of there, because we all know the benefits, especially lately, of high intensity interval training.
Yeah.
Right. And the concept there is that it's the change from one state or heart rate to another, either up or down, that generates parasympathetic tone.
Yeah.
And so that is a great concept, I think, for thinking about regulation. And one of the things I think we learned from this young woman, who we used her heart rate to help be aware of her internal state, is that we allowed her to titrate the fluctuations between her levels of her internal state in a way that didn't cause a problem for other people. Right? Because she had done that on her own for a long time, and that had caused, the symptoms had got generated that got to the level of needing some treatment. But letting her do that in a way where it was safe, it was predictable, we all could have access to what was going on, so it was predictable for her parents. Those kind of activities, I think, are really critical in coming up and then coming down, and going back up and coming back down. So many things we've done with exercise over the years, simple walking up and down stairs, or doing some squats, and just taking some measures of bringing that internal state outside the skin, so everybody has access to the changes. Seeing those changes can actually function in the behavioral sense as a reinforcer.
Yeah.
We get to see that we caused a change in our internal state, and allowing people to have access to that event and see that change help to motivate them to engage in it more. And I've seen lots of kids actually start to request, I need to walk up and down the stairs, or I need to go jog around the loop, or I need to get out my exercise bands. So that I think as a kind of an overarching theme, that idea of parasympathetic tone is one that I use a lot and find very useful.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. And just to kind of summarize really for what Kurt really talked about is that what we know that creates parasympathetic tone, right?
And can you just define that real quick, Jerry? Can you define that for everybody, parasympathetic tone?
So it's the beats between your heartbeats, right? So when you have 60 beats per minute, right?
Yeah.
Some people have very fast and they get to 60. So it's how those beats in between. And so what we know is that your heart is being regulated both by sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic arousal. But parasympathetic arousal is much more sensitive to regulating your heart rate. It happens much more quickly. It takes longer to regulate it. So that when we breathe in, we activate our sympathetic nervous system. And when we breathe out, we activate, which is why you take these sighs to relax yourself. Right? So that's to kind of look at that. But what we're learning now, more than sitting down and talking to people, although talking is really an important part of it, because right, it's socially, but we need pattern, repetitive, rhythmic, rewarding, and relational activities to be engaged in, right? So it's this kind of really pattern, rhythmic activity. So walking up and down the stairs, swinging on swings, going to the gym, all these kinds of things are really we're moving our body, but sending pattern, repetitive signals to our brain that is activating certain systems that is helping our brain in some ways move to a higher level of arousal and then back down. And if you think back to what we talked about in the attachment discussion, really that's what happened with a caregiver. A good caregiver read a response that the child was getting stressed, responded in a way, and brought that product down. And there was this rhythmic interaction. So as we get older, we begin to use movements and kind of, yoga. We could do bicycle, whatever you're doing. really is activating both the sympathetic part of your system, but also this parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a lot of research now that looks at some things like yoga that increase parasympathetic tone, to kind of looking at some of those things. So that's a really important, I think, concept that Kurt kind of highlighted, that we begin to know that. So sometimes when you, without even knowing about this, would take some of your clients for a walk, or go out and shoot baskets, all of a sudden they started talking to you. Right? Their bodies began to get regulated, and all of a sudden now they're back to social engagement again. Right. So it's that process that is so very important. So really helping people look at exercise, looking at people sometimes just getting up and moving, sometimes getting people, looking at those, I think they're called Bosey bowls, where they're out balancing and they're stimulating stuff. They don't know what they're doing. They're just on this ball, but really they're sending pattern repetitive signals to their brains and their bodies that are helping them. And for kids, it's really, really an effective way to engage non-verbally with kids and play, right? They're engaged in this kind of play movements and kind of looking at it.
Very cool. A few other things that, I think this is where also things like mindfulness can come in with the breathing. I love the 2-to-1 breathing, where you're exhaling more than you're inhaling, again, to sort of build the strength of that parasympathetic.
Exactly. That's where that all comes from.
Absolutely.
Om is activating your inner ear. Yeah. It's activating those parasympathetic nervous system pieces. It's really, 2,500 years of evidence we had around some of these things. Yes. They really are very effective.
Yes. There's interesting things out there as well. And I don't suggest anybody have their clients do this today. I haven't actually seen this published yet, but I know the military for vets with a lot of violent reactions for post-traumatic stress disorder are having them think about their trauma and then come back and then do the talk therapy afterwards. I haven't seen the results from that study, but I think, again, what I love about where we're going with trauma treatments, it's not just one person in a chair sitting across from another in a chair. Again, that's part of the equation, but yoga, Tai Chi, running, all these mindfulness, all these things really coming to the forefront as well, which I think is really a powerful way. And I just think it's a lot of that wellness stuff as well. When I teach about self-care, I bring in sleep, positive social connections. I think diet has stuff to do with this as well. When I especially was in
music, right? All those kinds of things that we're learning, that pattern repetitive beats.
Exactly.
Are really effective to kind of look at that.
Yeah. And how we can really think about folks from a wellness perspective, because if your body's well, your brain's more likely to heal too. So, all those factors come and play in here in really some fascinating ways.
I had a lady today, I did a consult with her, and that they're working in a clinic, and I asked her, what are the challenges you have about this trauma-informed? Right? She said, well, I came to work the other day, and it was like so busy and so overwhelmed. I forgot to eat lunch. I didn't even have time to go to the bathroom. And, I got to the end, and I said, that probably makes sense, because if you had a lion chasing you, you wouldn't stop to eat, and you wouldn't. So in your body, I said, really what you need to do is build some of these practices into your day to kind of looking at that, to kind of managing. So her arousal level was so high, it wasn't until the end of the day that she realized she didn't take care of herself at all.
Right. And we have to be careful of this from our perspective. I use the cup analogy for self-care too, because I see so much, maybe not, though I have seen it at times, the fight or flight or freeze response. I've seen some interesting things in my time, but boy, that rigidity piece of it. And I think we have to be really careful from a professional perspective, is because we have a lot of power in our relationships. And when our cups get full, sometimes I see the chaos coming out of us as well, but a lot of times we'll get very rule-based, very, black and white sort of thinking as well, which is not all that incredibly effective with the folks that need us to be flexible, adaptive, coherent.
Exactly. So you're going to do a commercial instead of what's in your wallet, it's what's in your cup.
Yeah. It's funny. People like talk about it. That people I haven't seen for years come up and kind of curse me at conferences. And say, hey, we haven't stopped talking about that cup for years. And it's like, well, that's a good analogy, I think, but they don't seem very happy the fact I talked about that.
Right.
So I think that's a good way to start wrapping us up here. Kurt, anything more to add to our conversation before we end?
No, the last thing I would add, kind of from a like a leadership perspective, I like where you're going with the differential power relationships and how important that is. You know, when I was in high school, I played football, and my coach was always talking to me about mental toughness. Mm-hmm. In that context meant when I had the urge to stop, how did I make myself keep going? That's what he meant by mental toughness. Yeah. Keep playing hard, even when you're tired.
Yeah.
Now that I am much older and in a much different environment, I think the needs have actually shifted the meaning of mental toughness for me. That in most of the time, I can get stressed by a bunch of little events that may or may not matter all that much. Most of them are not survival issues. So the real challenge of being mentally tough is to pause, check in with my internal state, and then make a decision about what to do, rather than listening to my stress response alone and just taking action over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the thing I would end with about how that's changed for me over the years and how I think about mental toughness.
Awesome.
So Matt, to end today, why don't we ask people to be really aware of their cups through the holidays? Right?
Exactly where I was going.
That's a nice ending, is as we get closer to the holidays, make sure that you have room in your cups.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great way to end our Thanksgiving edition of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. As always, you can find our show notes, links, and videos. If you haven't seen us on video, it's a little entertaining in and of itself as well. Jerry is always in a different room, it seems, in his house. He must be really rich because he just keeps shifting rooms on us.
I pull the screen down behind me.
I'm gonna get a screen and I can just change every day.
Yeah, we got to paint somebody's wall green and have fun with that. But you can find all that at Trauma Informed Lens, all one word.org. Love always to hear your comments as well. Thanks for all those that have been coming in. Final thought, I know from all of us, have a wonderful and safe Thanksgiving. And for all those, I just want to throw a special kind of shout out to, a lot of people in our field, especially in residential care and others, nurses, don't get the holidays off. And I just want to thank you for, I know those were some of my most rewarding and yet intense days. And so just a special thanks. I know for a lot of us, you either got Christmas or Thanksgiving off. So for those working over Thanksgiving, we just want to give you an extra thanks because we know the people that you're working with really need you over the holidays in special ways. So thank you for that. Keep an eye on your cups, and we'll see you next week.